Very warm welcome to those who weren't here last night. We've got off to a great start yesterday, and today is the first official session. I'd now like to invite my co-chair from the program committee, Andrew Levac, to introduce the chair of the session to you. Andrew.
Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the program subcommittee, it's a pleasure to be kicking off the symposium in earnest, and we'll start this morning with this opening plenary on the state of the field. And so for that, I'm going to hand it over to Shireen El-Feki. Thank you, Shireen.
Many thanks, Andrew. Okay, can everyone hear me now? Excellent, all right. Well, as Andrew said, I'd like to echo his comments. Welcome to this opening plenary. As Andrew mentioned, my name is Shireen El-Feki. I am a senior fellow with Promundo, but I'm also the author of Sex in the Citadel, which is an exploration of sexual attitudes and behaviors in the Middle East and North Africa. In the course of researching my book, I spoke to hundreds of men and women across the Arab region. And what was interesting in many of the young women I spoke with, they were increasingly educated, they increasingly employed, and they were looking for different lives than their mothers or grandmothers had led. And yet, in talking to these young women about the obstacles to change, they invariably mentioned young men, whom they said even if they are educated, even if they are traveled, they still had traditional ideas of a good woman, especially when it came to marriage and sex. And I have to tell you, this was summed up for me by a young woman, a Tunisian doctor, who said to me, you know, Shireen, women in our part of the world, when they are educated, their minds open. But the man, he is still at the prehistoric stage. So I have to say that a rather more nuanced perspective on this came to me from a Moroccan women's rights activist. And she had a slightly more sophisticated analysis. She said to me, men in our part of the world, they are hard to change. It is like oil and water. No matter how educated, how traveled they are, how much water there is, eventually the oil comes to the surface, the traditional ideas. So, you know, oil and water do mix. You just have to shake them up a little, and then you have to stabilize your new creation. Those of you in the audience who know about Hellmann's mayonnaise, well, this is just man's mayonnaise, basically. Or, as the Tunisian woman would say, man from hell mayonnaise. So what's interesting about this is this is exactly what you are doing in your parts of the world. You are shaking things up. You are trying to make new ideas, new ways of working stick and engaging men in gender equality. And this is a tremendous opportunity for me and for those of us from the Arab region who are here at the conference, because although we have some fantastic pioneers who are trying to do work with men and masculinities, we are still not as advanced as many of you from other parts of the world. And this is really, for us, a masterclass in engaging men in gender equality. So, in the course of this panel, we're going to hear from 4 speakers who are going to give us an overview of where we are on the long road to engaging men in equal rights for both sexes. I know that for the purposes of this audience, the panel needs no introduction, but for the record, we have with us Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, who is Executive Director of UN Women, and she's also UN Undersecretary General. Gary Barker, who is the founder and international director of Promundo, and also the co-founder and co-chair of the Men Engage Alliance. Michael Kimmel, who is executive director of the Center for the Study of Men and Masculinities at Stony Brook University, and Michael is also the author of a number of best-selling books on men and masculinity in the US. And Vivek Divan, who is a lawyer based here in Delhi. And Vivek has an extensive background of working on sexual rights, both in India and internationally. He's the former coordinator of the Lawyers Collective HIV/AIDS division, and he was formerly with the UNDP's HIV Health and Development Group. So a word about the format of this session. We're going to hear from each of our speakers in turn, and then we're going to tease out some of the issues in panel discussion. I know we are here in the world's largest democracy, which enjoys a freedom of speech which we in the Arab world can only aspire to. Sadly, we are in a sense a victim of our own success here at the Men Engage conference. There are so many of you here that it may not be possible to engage in questions and comments, and for that we apologize, but there will be plenty of opportunities throughout the next couple of days, and I'm sure our panel would be delighted to continue the conversation after this session. So, without further ado, I'd like to turn to Phumzile to give us a perspective on the recent gains and the challenges in bringing men to the table. I think not in the context of man's mayonnaise. We'll leave that aside for a moment. But please. Absolutely, absolutely.
Hello? Yeah, okay. Thank you for that kind introduction and for those highlights from your research. Again, I'm truly honored to be here and very thankful to everybody who's made this event possible, which in my book counts as a game-changing event because just the numbers of the people who are here, the countries that they represent, and the seeds that I hope we're planting all over the world. So once more, on behalf of UN Women, I'd really like to thank all of you for being here. We all know that in order to achieve development, peace, and sustainability, we have to change gender equality. So if we think about the facts that we're preparing now for the post-2015 development agenda, gender justice is actually a precondition for success. So in a way, what we're doing here is to help to provide the building blocks. With greater gender equality comes enhanced well-being, and communities and societies as a whole in terms of improved educational outcomes, better health, greater economic prosperity, and sustainable peace. And of course, gender equality can only be achieved if men and boys take full responsibility, working side by side with women and girls to redress the dynamics that hinder progress. I also want to highlight the fact that achieving gender equality is first and foremost a transformative enterprise. If we're not going to get to that point, I think we'll be shortchanging ourselves. So we have to keep on reminding ourselves about that transformative element of the work that we are about. It is also about breaking social norms and gender stereotypes that limit opportunities for women and girls and restricts men and boys to certain roles. The reconfiguration of power relations, transforming masculinities, and traditional perception of manhood are at the heart of this agenda. It requires men to question and challenge power dynamics in their actions or their words and to take responsibility for change. It also requires women also to take responsibility for change to the extent that women also contribute to sustaining gender stereotype and unhelpful forms of masculinity. It also requires that men give up some of the privileges that come with patriarchy. If this was class, we're asking men to say that it is about committing class suicide. I don't know what's the equivalent of committing class suicide in this context. We know that social and cultural norms about masculinity shape power relations and gender inequalities, and we need to use this as a positive influence. Men's decisions and behavior are profoundly shaped by these expectations related to masculinity. In a negative context, this has close links with the violence against women, as does men's experience of violence in their own childhood. From an early age, boys are socialized into gender roles that keep men in power and control. Many grow up to believe that dominant behavior towards girls and women is part of being a man. So systematically changing that narrative, therefore, becomes important. Positive parental involvement increases more equitable gender relations and less violent behaviors. Engaging fathers in modeling non-violent behavior is crucial to ending the cycle of violence against women, and encouraging men and boys to choose deliberately to act in positive ways lies behind some of the activities that I think we're all about in our small and big way. I think in positioning what we regard as a platform for crowdsourcing that he for she provides, it is about trying to find ways of bringing good examples of men that we can position so that we can generate as many role models as possible of positive masculinity, as well as give tasks to those that want to start engaging, to network and to link up with like-minded people. We would like to see that we provide a possibility for men to lead by example in their family and community by treating women and men equally, by challenging gender stereotype in all spheres of life, and by sharing equitably in family and household responsibility. We know that through their actions and their engagement, men can transform social norms, behaviors, and the gender stereotype that perpetuate and discriminates men. Discriminates both men and women. And because we're at this phase where we're preparing for what we can do in the global development agenda, I want to leave you with some of the sort of possible to-dos, and I'm repeating something that I said yesterday. In goal number 5, which is the goal that is proposed as a gender goal in the draft that is guiding us and that has been produced by member states with lots of contribution from civil society and other actors. The gender goal highlights the importance of ending harmful practices to women and girls. It identifies forced and early marriages, FGM, as some of the practices. And I want to throw this back to this constituency and say, this is something that men need to take up. Ending harmful practices that impact on women and girls we have handled it in a manner that makes women take the responsibility to do something. I think it's important that it is the men who take the responsibility to end these practices because they are always implicated in these practices. Depending on what part of the world you are, if where you are, the harmful practice that is prevalent is forced and early marriage, that would be the space that you'd operate in and therefore run with that. If it is female genital mutilation, that it is that. But there's another practice, especially in the more affluent world, that is video games. Video games that denigrates women and that teach boys about violence against women at a very early age. There are games that actually drive a player to make a choice between raping or beating up a woman as part of the game. And these are games that are played by 11-year-olds. So clearly, this is a big challenge and it is big money for those companies. And because the targets for those games are men and boys, this is an area in which men and boys need to lead. And it is a harmful practice to women and girls. I'm sure that I don't have to convince you. Again, in the gender goal, we also make reference to unpaid care work. We're very pleased at UN Women that this issue has made it to the draft document. Now, unpaid care work by its nature is fostered by the fact that women are at home doing the unpaid care work and men are expected to leave the home to do the paid work. Not unless we have more men who are doing some of the work at home to release the women to do other things outside the home, we will not be able to address this effectively. And this is something that is within men and boys at an individual level to do. We are highlighting the need to recognize unpaid care work, to redistribute it, to remunerate it, and to reduce it. And again, that provides an activity that can be carried on by men all over the world, and that would help to advance the gender goal in post-2015. Ending violence against women in all its form is another area that is addressed in that goal. And again, I'm sure we'll hear from other speakers the different forms of violence against women and the possibilities for men to play an active role as far as that is concerned. Violence against women remains one of the most dehumanizing form of discrimination against women, and as well as most prevalent and tolerated. So if we don't do anything else, that we have to make sure that we conquer. And for that, we need men to be part of it, because we need the beater not to beat. It's as simple as all that. Well, not simple, but, you know. And of course, the issue of representation. We need men to remove themselves from harmful practice of having unrepresented fora and decision-making bodies. The representation of men, of women in bodies that make decisions that impact on them depends by and large on women being invited, usually by men, and organizers of events. And we therefore I'm throwing this back and saying that men and boys must work with us here to make sure that they change that around. And I think if there's enough of you who actually refuse to participate in bodies that are not representative, to sit in boards, to sit in committees and so on, that would shake the system. We also have legislation that discriminates against women, especially legislation that impacts on women's economic well-being in 128 countries. We will be taking this up ourselves as UN Women and working with those countries to remove that legislation from statutes. But it would be very helpful if men were also leading in helping us to address that. We've got lots of lawyers who are men, who would know how to do this even better than we do. But also we need to enact, in some cases, laws that are supporting women. So both repealing and enacting is going to be a big deal in the post-2015, and I'm inviting you to be partners, because that is also critical for us to do. And of course, women's economic empowerment remains a very big challenge, because without women's economic empowerment and well-being, women are constrained from taking charge of their lives and doing the things that enhance their lives. And of course, men are penholders in many economic situations. They are CEOs of companies, they are employers, and they are decision makers in banks and so on. So again, I invite you there to play an effective and a meaningful role in turning around that situation. That's a little bit of homework. Thanks.
Many thanks, Phumzile. We're now going to hear from Gary, who's, with his decades of experience working with men and boys on the ground, how to turn these words into action, what's working and what's not.
Thanks very much. I'm going to take 30 seconds first and just say good morning, all. It is truly a pleasure and an honor to be with so many colleagues, activists, researchers, partners who have been doing this work and inspired so much of what we do and what we're trying to get across at this meeting. So really, truly an honor and privilege to be with all of you here. I want to, as we think about the state of the field and this thing we're calling engaging men, what I want to talk about is why the revolution in gender equality won't be won with a log frame. And as I was thinking about where we are as a field of engaging men as part of gender equality and driving gender equality, I was thinking back to how Promundo was founded. We didn't start off with a focus on transforming masculinities. We started off nearly 20 years ago looking at children and youth and HIV. One of our first projects was in 1996, and to take you back to those days, that was the time that Brazil and India were in the forefront of breaking the patents around HIV, making sure that, around antiretrovirals, making sure that treatment was available as a human right, taking on pharmaceutical companies, and really heady days in terms of what civil society could do to transform a huge global social problem. One of the first studies that we did was on the issue of children orphaned by AIDS. The National AIDS Program in Brazil had kind of talked about it, but it wasn't yet a priority. And we did an estimate on how many women had died because of HIV and how many of those had children, and therefore how many children were orphaned. The study got taken up by UNICEF and many others, and it made it into the national news. It was waived by a couple of very prominent HIV activists in Brazil before the head of the National AIDS Program, who didn't talk to us for a few years after that. But anyway, it got the attention. Within a matter of months, routine testing of pregnant women, availability of AZT and other ARVs was rolled out in a very impressive way in Brazil. AIDS-related mortality among pregnant women plummeted in Brazil. The number of orphans because of HIV also dropped dramatically. The Ministry of Health 3 years after that, it was about 99, looked at the data, basically took our same formula, which is always nice if you're a researcher and you get your formula repeated by the Ministry of Health, looked at those numbers again, and we were reading that report and saw how HIV as a cause of death for women with children under the age of 14 dropped on the list. There was this moment of celebrating, saying this is the kind of stuff that we as activists try to get to happen, working together in civil society to say, if we raise our voice together, if we have the good data that goes with it, if we have recommendations on a policy, we can drive change. And then we had this pause, and Miguel Fontes, who was the lead author of that, and myself looked at each other, because standing out was the #1 cause of mortality for women who had children under the age of 14. The #1 cause had become homicide. And we know that in this case we're talking about femicide, and we know that the vast majority of those deaths were women being killed by a male partner. So our moment of, can we celebrate? Yes. Are we also strikingly aware of what we have to do to push the needle on this issue? Yes. So why did I tell you that story for this field of engaging men? One, because I think we're at a somewhat similar stage. We have a lot that we can celebrate for how much interest there is, how much we've developed program approaches, we're trying to get policy approaches. There's a lot we can celebrate. But I think we also need to do a very strong reality check around acknowledging that patriarchy is not yet dead, and in fact in many spaces it's quite alive and ticking. So I want to talk about 4 key issues, or maybe 5 if I lost count, of where I think there's things to say we've got this amount to drive on, or we've achieved this, but we've got a huge amount still to move on. The first one I want to talk about is attitudes. And I do think it's important to acknowledge that whatever else we might say, there is a shift going on. There's a normative shift going on. Many of you know about our images study. Partners for Prevention has also done a multi-country study. Between us, we've got some 20 countries of data from low and middle income countries, finding pretty consistently that men are getting that gender equality as a vague idea is in the water. And we've looked at, so which men seem to be buying into that? And there's a cluster of stuff that comes out. Men who have some degree of secondary education, mother's education matters a lot, those who witness gender equality growing up in the home, if you're urban-based, if you're younger, if you have more stable income, all these men who have those characteristics are more likely to buy into gender equality as a vague idea. So there's a big but here. When we ask about, would you be willing to accept quotas to support different ways to promote in active, direct, policy-driven ways to make life better for women, then men begin to scratch their feet, look at the ground, and say, well, maybe not so much. The support drops way off. So I think it is important to say the stuff is out there. The good news is that we begin to see something of a spiral, a multiplication going on. Those who see their fathers and mothers involved in, women empowered, so the women's education point, seeing their fathers do more of the care work, there is a multiplying effect going on. But there's a huge amount of work to be done so that this actually is lived in the daily lives of women and men. Foremost among these, we'd want to talk about gender-based violence. And you know this data of the stubbornly high rates of multiple forms of men's use of violence against women. Our same study of images gives us a sense of which men are using violence. Attitudes matter a little bit. The far bigger issue is the violence that happens on the bodies of boys and men. The single largest factors that come out in our analysis of which men use gender-based violence are men who have witnessed it or experienced multiple forms of violence. Men who witness this growing up are 2.5 to 3 times more likely to use it later. Those involved in fights or victims of multiple forms of violence, about 2 times more likely to use violence against a partner later on. We have to affirm this every time we say this, is to say we're not making excuses for men. We can talk about this issue, we can talk about the violence on boys' bodies and say we're not making excuses for men and boys. But if you care about ending violence against women and girls, you have to care about the violence that's happening on the bodies of men and boys. The other good news that we have is that we've got a lot of ideas on what works at the program level. Coordinated community responses that do norm change together with group education, parent training programs, income generation programs for women combined with norm change, bystander intervention programs, and the list can go on. We've got some ideas on what can work. We've been abysmal in scaling them up, and that's a big issue that I hope we can come out here. We've been abysmal in funding them. And I think, and going back to the title of my talk about why the log frame won't win the revolution, we've also got to look at what societal change is required to get this to happen. Manuel Eisner did a review recently of countries that have high homicide rates and low homicide rates, and makes it really clear that there's only so much that a parenting education program can do. There's a lot of structural things. These are the things that come out in countries with low homicide rates. They have low social inequality overall. They have accessible and adequate health, education, social services. They have this thing called a state that's accountable to its citizens. Citizen action and collective action with the state, demanding better services, and functioning justice systems. So again, it's great to talk about the scale-up of programs, but we also have to be thoughtful here as advocates and activists on what we've got to do to get something called a functioning welfare state that is the kind of thing necessary, together with good programming, that will drive the changes that we want to do. And the last one, before I give you that busy slide, needs a little introduction. Phumzile mentioned the issue of care work. There's been a huge amount of attention to care work on what it means for women. We've been really slow to say, who's going to do the care work? Who's going to do the stuff that women aren't going to do? Barring some Martians joining us someplace, it's got to be men and boys. Because we know if we simply say, well, let's get the mother in the household into work, that we bring in other women to do the care work. How do we drive this agenda? I wish I could give you another great example from Brazil, but I do want to give you an example from Brazil that shows you just how far we have to move. Since at least early 2000, Papai, Promundo, many other groups have been doing work around trying to get men to do more care work in Brazil. And let me show you our not very dramatic results. National household data in Brazil shows that women's weekly hours spent in care work, women with children, went from 24 to 22 hours between 2001 and 2011. For men, we saw a whopping increase of 10 hours to 10 hours and 8 minutes. A whole 8 minutes of increase in men's time use. A little bit of math, if you thought that men and women might gravitate toward 15 hours for him, 15 hours for her, this average rate of change would take us about 240 years to achieve equality in care work. I don't think we're quite content to wait for that rate of change. So if we want to figure out how do we get men off the couch to do their share, we have to think about, she's got to have adequate employment outside the home that pays as much as he makes. We're talking about equal pay as well as equal encouragement of and driving men to do the care work. So I'd like to see, why don't we have enough of this image out there of men doing 50% of the care work. That needs to be in our post-2015 development goals as well. I don't think it's made it in there, but we're going to hold out for nothing less. Let's talk about another sticky issue, men's sexual and reproductive health. We've made a lot of noise. There's fantastic program development out there of how to get men in for reproductive health. And again, I wish I had more encouraging things to show, but this is the share of contraceptive use that's men or women between 2005 and 2013. In 2005, men were 25%. They're now 27%. That would be, in statistical terms, a rounding error. Now, I know that 50% of, we have more methods for women. There's lots of reasons that simply 50-50 might not be the ideal. But it is important to say, for as much as we've talked about it, we have not achieved anything close to a fundamental shift of seeing that reproduction and sexuality need to talk about men's sexuality, men's fertility. We've not driven the needle on this issue hardly at all. You know the HIV numbers as well. As we've dramatically shifted the face of AIDS, men are still far less likely to go for testing and for treatment. We know that we've got to do some big shifts that go bigger than this if we want to move and make sexual and reproductive health and rights, a universal right for all, and engaging men in that process. I think it's telling, and it deserves to be called out, that the world's biggest family planning initiative at the moment, FB 2020, has dramatic and impressive and important goals for women to use contraceptives. 0 goals for men. There is no expectation for men in there. I think that is a short change to women and to men, not to include a goal that we would like to see men doing more of this. The other thing I think that we need to feel brave enough to talk about is to say that as we talk about improving women's lives, we also have to say we are allowed to talk about things that ail men. We've got to talk about men's vulnerabilities in terms of how they affect men and in terms of how they affect women. You know some of these data on homicide, for example. 450,000 homicide deaths a year, 83% of those are women. And men. We care about that for men and women, lives lost and left behind, and we know that femicide is higher in countries that have high rates of homicide. We have to care about these issues jointly. We also have to look at one of the biggest challenges around men, a driver of, or an end result of what is perhaps happening in too many men's lives, is the recent WHO report that I think many of you may have seen on suicide. 800,000 deaths a year, dwarfs homicide and conflict-related deaths. 2/3 of those suicides are men. And I think what we see behind that is something speaking quite deeply to what ails men at multiple levels. Certainly one of those has to do with economic instability. And that brings me to my last point. I'm not sure if you can read this. This is painted on the sidewalk that I found in Lisbon, Portugal, country with one of those very high youth unemployment rates. Lots of very educated youth all dressed up and no place to go and writing some very interesting graffiti. This one said, "Please fire me from this unemployment." This is a country with nearly 50% youth unemployment rates. We've got to talk about poverty as it plays out in the lives of women and men. We've done a huge amount of talking about women's poverty, and we must continue to push on it. But I think we've got to get more sophisticated about how we talk about poverty in the lives of women and men. I think it's notable to remember the Oxfam study that came out, I believe, about a year ago, finding that the 85 richest individuals, and I should give those a gender face, I believe 84 of the 85 are men, if I'm not mistaken. So let's round it to men. 85 of the richest men in the world control the same amount of resources as the poorest 3.5 billion people on the planet. As we talk about patriarchy, I think it's important to say that poor men's patriarchy, as Naomi Hossein and others call it, is quite different than the patriarchy of those 85 men. If we look at the fact that worldwide, 1/4 of those in the workplace are working paid, in some paid activity outside the home, are working in informal and precarious situations. Or looking at numbers like that the Italian Navy fished out 150,000, mostly men, just in the last 12 months, coming from Africa and the Middle East, trying to find work in not very stable economies in Southern Europe, we get a sense of the extreme nature of what poverty means for women and for men. So I go back to my point about the revolution won't be won with a log frame. We've got to be brave enough to talk about these issues in structural, bigger ways that say we've got to unite our voices on it. And I do hope that during the rest of this event and as we think about the state of the field, that we're mindful of the big challenges that are out there, that we're thoughtful enough to say a battle between, are we working for men or for women, is something we've got to figure out a way to move beyond, and to understand that these big issues, that winning the revolution beyond the log frame requires not counting programs for men over here and women over here, but finding the common humanity that will drive us all toward greater equality. Thanks very much.